Hello everyone! So we're going to do a little quick, very small demo of how to kind of plan your washes and plan your process. So I've got my sketch here, just sketched out with mechanical pencil, like we talked about on Friday. And I'm going to start adding some wet on wet blending. So the nice thing about wet on wet blending, right, is it's very soft, everything sort of blends on its own. So I'm mixing up my colors for this background. Doing a little doorway. There's some greenery in it and some nice shadow and light play. So with wet on wet blending, a lot of times I put pigment down first and then add water so that I have a little bit more control, but you can also add water and then add the pigment into it. So do sort of a flat wash. I'm putting things saturation where there are shadows, or where I plan to have shadows, building things out. And then you can see that I come in with water and kind of spread that out, allowing the deeper shadow to sit wherever I've placed it. So now we've got kind of a nice base color in our greens and blues here. I want you to work in color families. So you'll see we're going to do all the cool colors, a base layer on them first. So now I'm starting to add in some blues to add some more light, some more vibrancy, and also to intensify my saturation and shadows. Now, remember that whatever you paint, especially when you're doing wet on wet, very wet, it's going to dry a lot lighter. So this tree has a lot more pigment that's not as wet, but that blue background is going to dry a lot lighter. I'm going to do a little fern hanging above the door, so we have two different types of greenery. I'm currently not worrying about preserving a lot of my whites. That is one thing when you're working with wet on wet. If you need to preserve whites in an area, you have to kind of plan for it and work at it, because wet on wet blending tends to sort of absorb everything. So you'll have to allow stages to dry a little bit more as you're working through in order to preserve whites if you're going to need light colors in there. So we're starting with light to dark, right, and working in color families, which you can see from the notes. I've broken out sort of a step-by-step, very shorthanded guide for how to approach your project this week. So continually, since this is very wet, you can see there's even standing water up there at the corner. I can just drop pigment in and it sort of ghosts out on its own. Once it gets to suede wet, like we talked about last week, where it's soaked into the paper but it's still very much wet, then the pigment won't travel as much. But right now it's very much spreading, very much going around. So let's say I didn't wait on this to dry and I started hopping over and doing my warm colors. This would happen. So we're going to pick that up. Remember that patience is key in this, and have this dry, and then we will revisit it. Okay? So we're going to touch in very final shadows so that everything that is a cool tone, everything that is a blue has been touched in this round. A blue or a green. The rest of this will be in kind of yellows and oranges, and we know, right, that if blue mixes with orange, you get really muddy colors. So that's also like, let it dry, switch out your water so that things don't get muddy on you later, and take whatever steps you need. Patience is your friend. Going ahead and dropping a couple little starter shadows onto these areas that will be yellow and orangey colors, because that shadow can kind of help layer underneath. So this is dry now. I just used a blow dryer and a little bit of patience. So I'm going to switch out my water like I talked about. I don't want you to, like, if you're working in contrasting colors, your water is muddy, it's going to affect how the colors come out, right? So light to dark, starting with the brightest yellow and then working around the side to kind of start adding in my shadow colors on this side. This is like a wooden barrel of some kind, I guess. Sort of making this up. So I'm not worrying about that one blending. I'm kind of letting it stand. It'll keep moving until it dries a little bit more. So I like to lay my brightest yellow down, knowing that that's my like warm light color. In this, we've got kind of a nice light. That helps me kind of also identify where my light is hitting. So these wooden doors, I'm also wanting it not to mix all the way because it'll help us create some nice wood texture as we carry through. Dabbing in, mixing a couple different colors, mixing in a little more orange, mixing in a little more red, mixing in a touch of sienna, and letting it stand and mix like on the page on its own. So wet on wet blending is really nice if you want these gentle, soft shapes. It's not as good if you're aiming for structure, right? So once again, we're going to kind of let that area dry. You don't want to be touching anything around there, but I can use this to start doing the time while that's starting to dry, to start doing some details of things that don't touch it. So more like dry details, tiny things if they're all somewhere. This have putting in some little drop shadows, putting in a little bit of like tiling work in areas that don't touch any of the spots that I have standing water. So if you can kind of plan to work around them, then you can jump around and touch everything. So this is a little bit more like dry blending. So these areas are dry underneath, and what I'm using a much heavier pigment load and less water to start getting a higher saturation, darker color. Also, less water, higher pigment allows you to get like crisper lines, right? So darker, more immediate line work. Our little fern here is starting to disappear, so we're adding some shape to that, and then adding some shadows into the greenery of this tree, so it has some depth. This got down to suede wet, so I'm able to go in and touch it up a little bit more, start shaping the barrel. So I let that dry again, and now we're going to go in and do kind of second round on our warms. So since everything's dry, I'm able to bring the yellow over and touch the greenery, warm up where the light is hitting that. While it was still wet, I dabbed in some other greens too and let them mix on the hanging fern there. I'm using the yellow to also define light in the woodwork and in our warm areas. And then doing kind of more of my dry technique again to keep building up my shadows, building up my blue and teal walls. So you don't want these little white outlines around everything, right? Unless you're meaning to, unless it's a highlight and it's on purpose. So I'm going in and making sure that I'm catching where these colors meet and marrying them with either the shadow, the highlight, or the midtones that they require. Sometimes the temptation of leaving watercolors so that like just nothing touches is very strong, but often that's not what we want, right? So now I have my flat edge brush, which is nice because I can get very tight angles with it. So this is very much like a dry approach where it's pretty dark. I'm doing more like line work, carving in some areas. So if we think about when we're painting light, warmth is what I consider like an active color. It tends to come towards you, and cool tones make good shadows. They tend to recede. Those are passive tones. So when we're carving light, you can see I've sort of prepped light areas that light is hitting with that warm yellow, and then allowing this like deep blue and deep purpley tones to help me block in my shadows. And it helps push those back and pull things forward. The other thing that helps things come into focus closer to us is more detail, more stark detail. So that's why wet on wet works really lovely for backgrounds. It works great for building up things, but then you're going to want to bring in these real textures and these real details to really have your specificity of your design, or in order to push something forward into the foreground. So the higher contrast of adding these little drop shadows, these little shadows along the side of the tree, drop shadow underneath the edges of things, helps push those forward. So higher contrast, more detail, really helps things come into the foreground versus letting those like doorways and areas just be kind of hazy helps them push back. Now, I'm gonna do just a little touch with white gouache in a couple areas here after I do this door with just sort of random textures, keeping it vertical. White gouache is a wonderful trick. I didn't preserve a lot of whites in this, so it's gonna help me do what we just talked about, which is bring some stuff forward. It's gonna help me push things into the foreground, give highlight, really define my light, but it can be pretty subtle if you work with it, or it can be really intense. So those little finishing highlights, those little finishing pieces are often what really helps us identify what's going on, what's happening, and what our focal points are of the piece. I could have preserved all of these whites, but I went with a little bit more painterly water blend style on this one. I'll do one with more preserved whites for the other demo. Pushing final shadows really dark, and then that pretty much finishes us. So as you can see, we went from wet blending through to dry blending and then did finishing touches. I hope that this is helpful. See you in the next one.